Welcome to The Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. I'm your host, Jure Ayub, and my goal is to use this platform to connect with activists, scholars, writers, and other weird folks from around the world to link our stories and interests up. Join me as we get into all sorts of futurisms, from solarpunk to degrowth, as we explore meaningful ways of creating links between the peoples on the periphery, and as we explore various topics from tech to anti-authoritarian politics, feminism, abolitionism, decolonialism, anti-racism, and all the other fun isms in between. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/firethesetimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. If you're a student, unemployed, or in any kind of financial difficulties, you can support with $2 a month or $20 a year. There are also other methods such as on PayPal or buymeacoffee.com, and you can find the relevant links in the description below or on the website. My goal is to make this project financially sustainable so that I can work on producing valuable content on a regular basis, such as this podcast, the newsletter, my essays, various online resources, and hopefully eventually YouTube essays as well. And if you like the content of this podcast, you can also check out the newsletter. In that newsletter, which I release on a quasi-monthly basis, I reflect on some of the topics discussed on this podcast and try to take them a bit further. The newsletter is free and you can get it by simply subscribing directly on the website. The Fire These Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Yusuf. Thank you for listening and take care. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Fire These Times. This first episode of 2022 is with Andrew Dana Hudson. He's a speculative fiction writer and sustainability researcher. His stories have appeared in multiple outlets such as Future Tense, Vice Terraform, MIT Technology Review, Grist, and many more. His 2015 essay on the political dimensions of solarpunk has helped define and grow the solarpunk subgenre. And this is what we primarily spoke about in this episode today. I found this episode pretty informative, and I think Andrew did a pretty good job at explaining solarpunk both for an audience that is uninitiated, so don't worry if you haven't heard about solarpunk before, and at the same time he managed to transform this into a pretty in-depth conversation on the potential of solarpunk as well. As I think most of you know by now, I'll be dedicating more episodes to discuss solarpunk, as this is a movement that I believe has great potential, and as usual I'm pretty bad at explaining why. But yeah, that's it from me, folks. Thank you for listening as always. I hope you find this conversation as entertaining and informative as I did. Thanks a lot, everyone.
My name is Andrew Dana Hudson. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a speculative fiction writer. Sometimes I call myself a climate fiction writer. I do research into sustainability and do narrative strategy and editing, a few other things. Yeah, happy to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. We'll be primarily speaking about one of the essays that you've written a few years ago called On the Political Dimensions of Solarpunk, which I think is going to be the title of this episode as well. I just stole it. Can you just, for those who don't know, like just from the start, can you explain what solarpunk is? I have done 2 or 3 episodes so far about solarpunk, so some listeners already know, but I'm going to assume that not everyone does know. So how would you define solarpunk?
Yeah, I think it's, I've called it a speculative movement because it seems to be broader than just kind of a speculative genre of fiction. There are people who see these aesthetics and these sort of genre conventions and are more interested in a kind of praxis than they are in being creatives in this particular space. But as a movement of science fiction and praxis, it seems to me to be about trying to tell stories in a future in which there's been some kind of green revolution, or there is going to be some kind of green revolution. It's about figuring out what a sustainable world actually looks like and how we get there from here. So I often talk about it in comparison to cyberpunk, the original punk subgenre, which I think is a really good point of comparison. And I think solarpunk is kind of the true the true heir, if you will, to cyberpunk. And when cyberpunk emerged in the 80s, it was at a time in which science fiction was really, it was a lot of time travel paradoxes and wormholes and galactic space empires
Mm-hmm.
and all these sorts of really cool ideas. But there was some writers came onto the scene who said, look, all that stuff in out in space is missing what is changing life right here on planet Earth, which is computation. Right, that was the technological revolution at the time.
Yeah.
And so they created a canon of literature and an aesthetic based on imagining computation sort of spinning out into to be a more dominant force in the world, which of course it now has, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like they just nailed a lot of those kind of basic predictive elements. And they called it cyberpunk because they mostly told these stories from a countercultural perspective, right? From the perspective of the people who were, uh, fighting the system
Mm-hmm.
or marginalized by the system in a more elaborate way than the average kind of cyber prole, right? Who were sort of rebellious in some manner and not like living a mainstream life where wake up in your like tiny apartment and you like fill your cyber briefcase and you go to your cyber job
Mm-hmm.
at like Wayland Yutani Industries or whatever, right? Um, and go home and eat your cyber meal, right? So the cyberpunks are all like the hackers, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
mercenaries, the like all these cool people. Um, and so, for me, I think where solar punk kind of comes into the equation is uh, looking at our current situation and be like, okay, there's a new set of technologies that are changing the world, right? And they're for the most part technologies of sustainability. They're uh, really cheap renewable power, which seems to get cheaper and cheaper, right? Solar in particular, um, and has solar in particular has this like distributed potential to really change where and how our society gets and moves around power. And then there's like permaculture, there's technologies of adaptation to the changing climate, there's a little like biotech in there. There's all kinds of like traditional knowledge that um, is being sort of rediscovered and is being found useful. And so the question is like, okay, who are the punks in this situation? Who are the
Mm-hmm.
people who are taking these technologies to sort of like a bleeding edge place, and in the context of this technological upheaval are living the countercultural lives and not the mainstream lives, and like what are their stories, right? And in that context, I think it's not hard to see how you get to the sort of typical kind of solar punk like optimism, right? Because the 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 normal majoritarian like position on a lot of these questions of the future is like we're doomed, like just like the system can't be changed, and all we can do is sort of live increasingly like sad and nihilistic lives, increasingly distracted by the sort of digital
Mm-hmm.
figments being fed to us. So and so solar punk is like pushes in an opposite direction and says like cyberpunk was about technologies that abstract human relationships with the world, right? That drive our lives into greater and greater levels of abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
And solar punk is about technologies that de-abstract human relationships with the material world, right? That give us more agency over food and water, over the climate, over the land. So uh, that's kind of where I try to look at it. I think you know it also brings in a whole host of people who are like seeing solar punk as an opportunity to tell stories about social justice, which is like sorely needed to tell stories that are more diverse and bring in perspectives from you know from around the globe, from different marginalized identities, from Afrofuturism and Indigenous futures and disability futures and queer futures, and I think those all sort of seeing solar punk aesthetics and wanting to play is great. Um, but I think that's I guess that's probably a big enough spiel to be working with.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that. I guess you already answered part of it, but because the next question was going to be like, how did you go from looking at solarpunk as an aesthetic, which a lot of people I think still think of it that way, to assessing its political economy, which is obviously the main essay that I was looking at, and what does that kind of look like?
Well, when I wrote that essay, solarpunk just was sort of like very just the beginning
Hmm.
to kind of peek into the consciousness. And uh, so, I think like assessing is kind of a tricky word there because there wasn't a lot to assess, right? Like there wasn't a lot of solar punk literature. There was like a little art. There were like a few stories. Um, there, were kind of these like fashion sketches on Tumblr
Yeah.
that, when paired with some of the kind of like trees on skyscrapers, seem to like imply a kind of vibe. And so and there was like some manifestoing going on, right? And there's been like constant manifestoing for like the last 7 years. And I read Notes Toward a Manifesto
Hmm.
essay by Adam Flynn, who was uh, someone that I had sort of been acquainted with in the Bay Area. He was like roommates of one of my best friends, and so I read this essay and was like, oh, I know this guy. So I went and like made him get a beer with me, and we started talking about solar punk and wrote some solar punk later. But I think for me it was like having those conversations and kind of getting a sense of what kinds of futures people were starting to play with, and just sort of wanting to offer some uh, sense of like grounding of some the essay is really like advice to people
Hmm.
on to like kids on Tumblr who were like somewhat slightly younger than me, right? Which now feels like the idea that I was like an elderly know-it-all 6 years ago. Now it feels very funny, um, but it was trying to say like, oh, this implies a certain set of political arrangements, right? Like the fact that we have that there's in my mind not a lot of like magical technologies
Yeah.
in a lot of these imageries, right? Like there's people are still have headphones in, they like it seems like they still have phones. There aren't a lot of flying cars. I mean, sometimes you see a flying car in solar punk art. Um, but it sort of gives us a sense that like, oh, maybe what this is suggesting is not that we invent a bunch of new never heard of technologies, we discover new scientific principles, and then this sort of creates a rippling change to our society, and this is what that new society looks like if we invent those things. But rather like it implies that we change our political relationships to each other, to technologies, to how we build our cities, how we what kind of labor we pay for, uh, all those like green skyscrapers. You need a lot of like gardeners like hired as supers to keep those trees alive,
Hmm.
um, and how we treat each other, and so yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about uh, the sort of here to there of getting to those kinds of sustainable political relationships, and just what sort of ground we were building on when we pursue a solar punk future. I don't think Solarpunk has to be 100% engaged with like what do we do in the 2020s, what do we do in the 2030s. Like you can go further out, right? People do, but that for me was like the most interesting part of the question, and so I kind of wanted to riff uh, on that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Is it fair to say that what kind of separates solarpunk as a genre, as an aesthetic, or as you call it, a speculative movement, is a sense of a present urgency. So it's not just that. Obviously, most of these stories are set in the future, um, but they're responding to a real need in the present. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we live in very like impending times, right? Like
Yeah.
the climate crisis is here. Um, we're in the cyberpunk dystopia, but the problem is that like turns out that like it doesn't even work very well, right?
Hmm.
Like handing power over to the big tech digital mega corporations. uh, they're not actually able to like solve the problems that are even going to like afflict them in the future. Um, so you know that yeah, it implies a kind of urgency that I think we all naturally feel. And the other thing is like all science fiction, all speculative fiction is really written about like the time that it's written in, right? It's really not about the future. Like the great stuff is about the politics and the culture and the vibe of the present. And our like vibe of the present is time is running out, and so
Hmm.
that's going to make it in. That's going to make it into both how we the stories we tell and also how we interpret these stories and these vibes. And so yeah, that's it's precarious, but also really exciting. There's a term that I use in a book I have coming out next year called Our Shared Storm, which is my first kind of novel-like book, even though it's kind of a fix-up novel. Um, but it has a sort of an extended section on climate fiction and how I think it works. And there's a term I use called post-normal fiction.
Hmm.
So in sustainability, there's a term called post-normal science, which is like very influential on the discipline of sustainability. And the idea is um, that you could imagine like a sort of a chart space with an x and y axis, and the x-axis is uncertainty, and the y-axis is stakes. And as you get further out, you sort of move out of the realm of like pure science, where you're just doing just 100% abstract research, into this world of applied science. And then you're kind of go out into this world of like advocacy and consultancy, right? Where policymakers call upon scientists to kind of give their opinions, and like those what those opinions are like affect the real world, have real stakes, and are maybe trying to answer questions about problems that are not as clear as those in the laboratory. um, and then if you go out even further, you get into what the Ravitz and Funkowitz, I think, were the authors, what they called the post-normal realm, which is um, an area where the stakes are high or uncertainty is high or both. And you're sort of dealing with wicked problems where you kind of only get one shot. But their argument is you can still do science in this situation. And I
Hmm.
think, we can look at kind of the similar graph and be like, this is something that authors and all kinds of different disciplines might be doing, right? Like that when we write climate fiction, because it is speaking to a particular political moment about something that is like very impending and uncertain, and the stakes are very high, that we're kind of doing a post-normal fiction. Um, and that means that I think a lot of people think of it very differently, right? That they stop feeling like I want to create like a piece of kind of pure literature, and people start being like, man, how can I use my stories, use my whatever my creative talent is to like nudge the world in a better direction, because like I've got to do something. And so, I think there's an activist bent to a lot of this. There's it can be a little didactic, it can be a little prefigurative, where people are sort of using solar punk and uh, the other kinds of speculative fiction to like to game out these problems and try to figure out how we solve them, as opposed to just say, here's where I imagine it going, or here's what the future is going to be like, right? Um, if you want to just like purely predict the future, I don't know if like solarpunk is the best place to start, because it's like, it's an unlikely proposition. Like a lot has to go right for us. We have to like flip a lot of coins and win those coin flips. But I think solarpunk sort of says like, okay, mm, like let's figure out what it looks like if we make good choices, right? Like let's tell stories about that situation, and hopefully in the process figure out what those good choices are, and kind of mobilize our collective imaginations um, to kind of get on that get on that bandwagon together.
Yeah, and you do mention in the essay like like even a possible limitation to solarpunk, that it can't do everything. But before sort of asking that question, well, the essay was written in 2015, I think, and you had written back then that solarpunk, I have the quote here, is a creature wholly of this decade, native to global network society. And I definitely, I read it a few months ago, I think, for the first time. But there's definitely something about solarpunk that feels even today very 2010s, which doesn't mean that it doesn't also feel 2020s. In many ways, I feel like I'm still, because of COVID, I think I'm still in my mind still in 2010s, but that's a different thing. Because it's like enough time has passed, or had passed and still has passed, for the internet to no longer be that much of a quote unquote new big deal for many people. I'm definitely among those who feels native to the internet, whatever that means. Probably the first generation to say so as a millennial. Certainly true for those who are younger than me as well. Um, what's your understanding, or like, if you why do you think the 2010s were the decade, let's put it that way, where solarpunk really started becoming a thing?
Well, I think there's kind of pure technological reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like uh, that was the sort of historical moment where we started to really see the cost uh, of solar power and other renewables just like plunge,
Mm-hmm.
and start and really begin to outcompete um, fossil fuels. And from a sort of this is what we're doing in the new technological revolution standpoint, you know, like Gibson said, the street finds its own uses for things, right? That's sort of classic cyberpunk saying. And so with when the new thing is this new renewable energy technology that is shaking up sort of power structures that flow from our energy system, uh, then uh, we have to figure out what is the street doing with those things, and that takes us to a different place than cyberpunk, that sort of um, calls for a new moment. And I also think that um, when I wrote this, I look back at this essay and uh, how like influential it's turned out to be, and and but also I feel a little chagrined because I like 100% missed what was like around the corner, right? I wrote this for a moment in which it felt like we were just locked into a kind of neoliberal stagnation, and the only bright spot was uh, a like just this sort of budding on the margins of a new kind of imaginary that I saw in solarpunk, right? And then a year later, we have Brexit, we have Trump. All of a sudden, my sense that the like ruling class that poured molasses all over the levers of change was just totally went out the window, right? Like became very clear that rather than, this sort of neoliberal establishment like firmly having their hands on the steering wheel and controlling where society goes, and like no one had their hands on the steering wheel, and everyone was just like slumped down, like shoving their foot into the gas pedal. And, so in that situation, I think it slightly turns out to be kind of slightly different, right? Where, the levers of change are up for grabs, and we can imagine a politics that uh, radically shifts the direction of our world, of our societies, that doesn't need to sort of be this kind of prefigurative lifestyle in the margins of these technologies, right? That we can imagine it coming from a revival of the trade union movement, from like mass use movements, right? A kind of from mass politics, and not from this kind of counterculture. Um, but at the time in 2015, where we were like really feeling the drag of the Obama years here in the States, and um, really kind of feeling like um, you know the sort of um, the that we weren't at an end of history, but like uh, if we were going to like have new history happen, like something we need to be sort of very deliberately like crack that shell open. Um, and it seemed like imagination and um, these kinds of people and practices that I and others were identifying as kind of like a new generation of both science fiction and also just like real life punctum, um, was uh, uh, yeah, like that was the place for it. So, um, and I think, the just sort of mechanically of how it emerged, right? Like it emerged from people on Tumblr who are like very genre savvy, discuss like seeing sort of a lacuna and wanting to fill in um, what goes in that sort of genre spot. Um, it didn't emerge from a bunch of sci-fi writers deciding to uh, write some edgy stuff, and then that stuff getting collected and called solarpunk, right? Solarpunk as a term inspired a lot of people to write particular kinds of stories, and I think that uh, shift from like we want to talk about genre, we're like super hyper media savvy teens on Tumblr, to like established science fiction writers writing in very much inspired by these ideas and aesthetics, right? That's like a flip flop that is very contemporary, is very uh, of internet culture in the teens, and um, uh, so and again, it's good science fiction is always about the politics of the moment, right? And um, our politics in the teens, and what we felt sort of impending, um, were required a new kind of storytelling to deal with, right? Like cyberpunk, that's about urban decay and corporate power and globalization, right? Those are the sort of core anxieties underlying that. And so with solarpunk, it's global social justice, the failures of late capitalism, and the climate crisis. Um, and so those of like, I think our primary concerns have shifted a lot since 2015, right? Like now, I think a lot of people would say that it's like even more the climate crisis, um, that it's the rise of fascism amidst the failures of late capitalism, and it's you know not just sort of global social justice, like that, those are like probably taking a back seat to the ways in which we now see inequality playing out through the lens of the pandemic, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so, like Solarpunk stories, like none of us were really out there predicting something like COVID, right? So, um, if you were like reinventing Solarpunk now in 2021 or 2022, I think you'd come up with something very different, right? Um, because the ground has shifted. So yeah, all these things are I think are very historically contingent, but that like sort of what makes them really easy and interesting for uh, and open for lots of people to engage with, right? Because we're all living in that history, and so we all have opinions about it.
No, for sure. You mentioned the focus of global justice, and I found it very. I think one of the elements of that essay that kind of grabbed my attention the most is that you actually do mention the importance of care work, not just. I mean, it always has been important and still is important, but it definitely seems, based on just demographic trends and stuff like that, that it's going to be even more important in the future. And I didn't actually know how to ask this question, but why did you walk us through your thinking, if you can remember it, of like how you thought, why you thought it was important to include care work in a discussion about solar punk?
Yeah, so this essay was really kind of an attempt for me to um, bridge between the kind of predictive analysis of ongoing history by some cyberpunk thinkers who I like really respected and followed, and the sort of this new type of futures thinking that I was seeing from not from the older gurus, but from like the younger crowd, from people who were just a little bit younger than me at the time. And a core part of the essay tries to cast solarpunk in light of something that Bruce Sterling, who's a really successful novelist and kind of one of the originators of the term cyberpunk, and was the editor of Mirror Shades, which is um, sort of the classic cyberpunk anthology. Sorry, Bruce, I stole his term for a story of mine called Solar Shades. It's also the name of my newsletter, solarshades.club. Um, and but he was saying a lot in the sort of early teens that the future is about old people in big cities afraid of the sky, right? That
Right.
um, if you want to predict the future, right, like rather than being like, oh, the future is going to be about X technology or gadget or X, the rise of Web X or whatever. Um, and you should just look at like the things that seem like unshakable inevitabilities, right? That's the demographics of people are getting older on the planet as a whole, right? Like because we're living longer and we're having fewer kids, so the demographics of how old the average person is are shifting. Uh, the vast majority of the planet is the majority of the planet now lives in cities, and pretty much everyone else is trying to get there, right? We're urbanizing very quickly. Um, and the climate crisis is impending. So uh, I think I tried to sort of say like, okay, this is where we're at. This is like the situation. If we're going to imagine a science fiction that is like youthful and hopeful and like fresh, then we have to sort of like recognize these realities, right? Because this is not something that's going to change very easily, any of these. So, I think care work is super important and something that's been like consistently devalued by capitalism over the last few decades, and the end of uh, the the end of our lives is like increasingly miserable for more and more people, even those who were ostensibly middle and upper class, right? Um, and so, in that context, I think, if we're talking about like family life, if we're talking about like the kinds of jobs that are in the background of work that's going on, there's just going to need to be a lot of that. There's going to need to be more multi-generational households. There's going to be lots of people who, you can imagine being your cyberpunk or your solarpunk heroes, um, who are sort of their day job is going and being like a long-term care nurse or something like this, right? Um, and it's going to be like a core issue that communities are going to have to deal with, right? Unless they're communities with no old people, right? But like if your solar punk communities don't have any old people in them, um, then the all the old people are somewhere else, and you have to figure out how to, like, if you're going to save the world and make it sustainable, you have to do so for them as well.
Mhm.
Um, so and I think like history's borne this out, right? Like COVID has been just a horror for the elderly population. I mean, that's where so many of the deaths have come from. Has been nursing homes and um, from the elderly, and just in it just seems like uh, all our kind of benign neglect turned into extremely malign neglect in that context, and so that's going to be, we if we're going to have a world organized around more just principles, this is just something we have to figure out. My parents are getting older, and figuring out was the right thing to do by them, and how do I ensure that, like, my life going forward is one that uh, that our lives are kind of both able to move forward, and one or the other of us doesn't drag us down, or I don't
Mhm.
like sort of put them to the side or any of those things, right? Those are kind of the intricacies of modern relationships that I think uh, solarpunk can, that offers a lot of grist for drama and storytelling, and the sort of base stuff of having uh, of imagining how people live, right? So yeah, I mean, I think also there's just sort of fits in with a general shift away from um, work is about uh, you know showing up to a workplace, a bullshit job uh, in an office, or work is about like manufacturing things in a factory, um, to work is about care, and meaning caring for each other, caring for the land, caring for non-humans, caring for crops, these sorts of things, caring for landscapes, and sort of of the more urban variety. Um, and we've got plenty of big stuff to build too. We've got like a lot of machines to construct to like have a shot at a sustainable future. But um, you know, more and more, I think we'll probably see a shift to that, you know, especially since it seems like people are increasingly not wanting to uh, spend a lot of their lives in like service jobs that are increasingly thankless and are way behind on wages, right? I mean, we've got all these sorts of walkouts and the Great Resignation happening here in the States, and um, you know the the shift of sort of the primary locus of the economy from uh, of the post-industrial economy from service to care, I think is, you know, that's like a pretty good bet. As a futurist, you could predict that, and you'd probably be all right.
This actually ties into the section. Well, pretty good part of your essay is on cities. And what I'll do, if that's okay, I'll just read a
Sure.
small paragraph that you wrote. Okay, so I'm quoting: "Cities don't die. Cities happen where people gather, and people gather in cities. Because of this, the cities we have today are largely going to be the cities we have for hundreds of years. They will grow and sprawl where they can. We cannot start anew from scratch. We must reuse and refurbish the built environment. To paraphrase Sterling, the man you mentioned before, the wreckage of the unsustainable is our frontier. What we build never goes away. Often it must be lived in. End quote. I think a lot of people, when they think of solarpunk, and I've kind of had conversations with friends to sort of try and gauge, like, when I describe solarpunk, what are the sort of things they think about? And it's usually two things. One is like more like, I don't know, the Shire, but with technology. And the other is like high rise buildings, but with, green balconies or something like that. And I definitely, if you just Google images like solarpunk, you will sometimes see some of that. But the stories that I've been reading, and obviously your essay, definitely goes against that. If I would call it a trend, but definitely against that tendency. But anyway, how would you view the relationship between solarpunk and cities? And I guess it definitely does tie into the previous question about care work as well. So you don't have to repeat that. But yeah.
I think, this was again sort of like a cautionary note
Yeah.
to the people that were at the time, I saw kind of doing a lot of this new imagining,
Mm.
and sort of saying like, uh, don't try to like imagine, you know, idealistic communities that are kind of off the grid or not engaged with real places as we imagine them. I mean, you can. I've read plenty of good stories that sort of take, you know, start from that point, but you know that I if we don't change our cities, then we don't succeed, right? We sort of all the bad things coming to our civilization are just going to come if we don't change how our cities look and feel and provide for
Yeah.
people, and how they work from a logistics and a transportation standpoint. And so uh, from like a pure sustainability standpoint, there's just like energy efficiencies that you get from having people live densely that we just have to leverage. From like a futurist standpoint, if you were to just like do like random person generator in 2050 or 2030 or whatever, like almost certainly that person is going to live
Mm.
in a city, right? Like just the vast majority of people are going to live in something that we consider either urban or suburban, right? um, and but just seems like we with the way that we've yes, we need to change how we build, right? Like we need to stop building for planned obsolescence, and trying to build new things that last a long time, right? That can last into like a solid long now of hundreds or even thousands of years, or can be maintained to. But um, I think the sort of the two ways that we sort of get distracted is by sort of running off into the woods, right, building a little shire, or by just sort of imagining the kind of perfect future cityscape that is fresh built, right?
Mm.
That doesn't, um, which is what a lot of those sort of green architecture renderings uh, look like, right? And they don't have people in them. At the most, they have little render ghosts
Yeah.
running around and just sort of like enjoying the scenery, right? But you don't have people with jobs and stories and worries and relationships and friends and lovers and family that they're sort of tied to inhabiting these places. So I think something that I like is if you've got like a giant uh, you know brutalist but with greenery sort of uh, structure, it's not actually solar punk. It doesn't become solar punk until there's graffiti on it too, right? You
Yeah.
need to have that sort of human handprint. But yeah, I I think it the question of how we retrofit this stuff is just a really like interesting and tricky part of the sustainability problem, the wicked problem that we face, right? Like the idea that okay, let's just like buy some land, let's build like a skyscraper that's arcology that recycles all its water and gets all its energy, and like boom, that's like okay, you've provided housing for like 2,000 people or something like that. Like good job, just like the tiniest minuscule part of the problem, right? The new like $1 trillion infrastructure package that just passed has $15 billion to get rid of lead pipes, and everyone's saying like, oh no, to get rid of America's lead pipes, you definitely need at least 30 to $50 billion, right?
Right.
Like, why can we not just be like, oh, just don't live where there's lead pipes, just like go out into like the unspoiled world and like build afresh, right? Like we can't do that. Like people live there, we need the housing. Like people have lived there for a long time, we don't want to kick them out of their homes, right? Like they're part of communities. These houses with lead pipes are like, a part of a fabric. Um, so we have to go, and it's like much trickier work in some ways, at least from sort of an imagination standpoint, uh, to to do that because you got to tear up streets and like it's annoying to like do this in places where it's sort of people have to like deal with the construction noises and all these sorts of inconveniences. In my new book that's coming out, there's a little bit that I'm quite fond of, in sort of there are 5 scenarios, and one of them is a little more of like a solar punk utopian one where we sort of mostly handled the problems or are on our way, and they're at the climate negotiations, and uh, the narrator, or sort of the perspective character from this section, um, is from California, and he sees um, these sort of like swaggering guys from Africa come in from who are like from Ghana and Nigeria and South Africa and various places, and he's like, oh man, they had it so lucky, they were able to you know not get stuck with all this zombie development that we are just like up to our neck in California, that are still just kind of like trudging along, like we built the modern world and we built it wrong, and these people have gotten to like skip a lot of our mistakes, right? Like totally leapfrog us. um, so uh, and build the implications that they've built these kind of Afrofuturist kind of visions, and that Americans are kind of stuck, burdened with the sort of previous centuries mistakes, and that takes longer to kind of dispose of than
Right.
to create these arcologies afresh. So
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I actually look. You sent it to me. I haven't got it yet, unfortunately. I read the first chapter, but there's a very interesting link. You just made it as well now. Like the relationship between Solarpunk and Utopia. I don't know why. I sort of don't see them as necessarily the same thing, but they're definitely sort of in conversation with one another. You write, so I'm going to quote you again. Punks are an essentially antisocial or at least countercultural force, rejecting and attacking the norm. In this case, that means understanding that the beautiful clothes and buildings Solarpunk envisions are likely to be surrounded by something very different. The cracked concrete of decaying infrastructure, the smudged plastic of cheaply made gadgets, the intimidating glass and steel of financed fortresses, end quote. You just mentioned it now, like that idea of California in the future, for example, or now. But so I guess the obvious question here is: would you define solarpunk as a utopic genre, or what do you see the relationship between solarpunk and utopias?
well, clearly a lot of people who are inspired by solar punk are inspired in a kind of utopian way, right?
Yeah.
Like they see this and they're like, this is what like their imagination is cracking open the problem of like how do we imagine utopia, um, and some of the plenty of the work that gets done is not engaged in this sort of like um, more near future intermediary time where we're like trying to solve these huge problems, and like let's sort of turn our literary camera to what's happening among these like weirdo solar punk people that are totally bucking the norms and rebelling against conventions and power structures, and are they sort of like the class, the revolutionary class, in sort of a Marcuse kind of way that is going to like be able to overthrow the hegemonic forces. And uh, that's kind of the section that I'm I'm mostly interested in. Not entirely. I quite like utopias and their discontents, right? I like imagining like we've got a Green New Deal, or like we fixed all these problems, right? Like what is the drama? What is the thing that's gonna like have people griping about, and kind of tell a story about that? But like I don't want to box anyone out, right? Like Becky Chambers' novella, A Psalm for the Wild Built, is like clearly like I don't know. Becky can totally like call me up and correct me on this if if she feels like it, but it seems like that would not exist in its current incarnation had like solar punk as a kind of aesthetic discussion not happened, right? And it's a great story. It's like so fresh and nice, and very much like we live in a society that's just fundamentally good and just, and like it's still not going to make us 100% happy, but we're going to be empowered to like seek out our happiness. And in some ways that puts a lot of responsibility on us to do so, um, and to get it right. So I think we have to include that kind of work, and there was tons of that sort of utopian imaginings, and I was a story reviewer for this climate fiction contest that this website Grist had earlier this year, the Imagine 2200 contest.
Yeah, they're really
And
good. Yeah.
they're really good. And so, me and Serena Ulibarri and Tobias Buckle, we all kind of like cracked down to like the top 20 out of like 900 some stories. And, that was, of those, like tons of them were kind of solar punk utopias. And I think that, you know, that is something that uh, we really do need to engage with and write. I think, last year, a couple years ago, um, the science fiction writer Carl Schrader tweeted something about how like um, people would prefer dystopias they understand to utopias they don't understand,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, our current, wherever you're at in the world, like you are, if you were a living person, like still living, and some people are in such desperation that they absolutely will take anything else. But for a lot of people, we're kind of just on the border, right? Like we know we've got problems, but we are sort of surviving, and we know that there's kind of a place for us in the world where we are sort of scraping by. And if you go to those people and you say, we're going to change everything, we're going to upend the whole system, um, we're going to change, how we make laws, and that we're going to change how our communities are formulated, we're going to change our households, a lot, and it's not unreasonable for those people to sort of go with the devil they know, right? Or to be like, in some ways I would rather like keep this world in which I know there's a place for me than embrace a radical vision that I might uh where there just might not be a place for me. So we have to kind of like help them see that, themselves in these futures. And I think telling utopian stories, and in which people can be like, okay, so that's what I would be up to were we to abolish capitalism. That's how I would go about my day and find like meaning in my life. Um, that's sort of like what the content of my memories and my relationships would be. That kind of work I think is really important. And so, I don't think there's any need to sort of box it out of solarpunk.
Mhm.
I do think that, if we're serious about this as like a punk genre and not just sort of like a call to a broader utopian thinking, um, the solar punk pieces that I find most effective and that I often try to write are the ones that um, are about this like sort of bucking the norms of society, right? Um, and are about the individuals that are the punks, that are the counterculture, um, that are doing something that's sort of like inherently, not the mainstream. Um, so, and because that's where a lot of innovation happens, that's where a lot of like cool, dramatic ideas happens. That's where people who, if we prefigure them, they may be prefiguring the further future. They might be sort of the lead of a trend that will soon encompass, you know, millions and millions. Um, so I think, you know, also I don't, clearly solar punk is a reaction against dystopian thinking, right?
Mhm.
Um, you know, in a way, the like I think that was really having a moment kind of in the early teens, right? Where you had, your Hunger Games, you had your Elysium, you had, on and on and on. And that was kind of like the grist of a lot of sort of American pop culture, particularly, and like particularly YA culture, which I think, for the like youth that first started talking about solarpunk on Tumblr, right? Like this is the kind of thing that they're trying to chart an alternative to. So, um, we don't want to do dystopian, uh, or at least, if we want to accept the dystopian like reality and then figure out what is the utopian um uh tendency within that, what is the sort of countervailing wind. um these are all just different strategies that we
Mhm.
can take, different kinds of seeing instruments that we can use to try and like solve these problems, right? Because like I said, it's a post normal situation. We're using this genre, this literature, to like actively uh, figure out what our future should look like. And you know, I'm like I'm think the future, like a lot of it emerges from material conditions, right? A lot of it is out of our hands. Um, but a lot of the people who uh, were inspired by cyberpunk, who maybe weren't the science fiction authors, but were sort of like the people being like, "Ooh, yeah, this is interesting." Like, man, some of them went on to like make some real cyberpunk dystopian technology, right?
Yeah.
Like some of them went on to be Silicon Valley types and were inspired by that literature to get into computers. So um, if we can and create a literature that inspires people to get into ecosystem repair and sustainability and climate removal or carbon removal, climate repair, permaculture, all these sorts of things, then like hell yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. That does seem to be very, like, it's become almost of a joke online, I guess. But like the recent announcement of like those, I forget what they're called, like those robot dogs or what have you, and the whole Facebook and Ray-Ban glasses and stuff like that that really feels that it's coming out of a Black Mirror episode. At some point, like that, even that comparison feels that it's not enough anymore. Like the as you say, like the dystopian realities. Let me put it this way: there was a time I remember some years ago when watching Black Mirror, just as an example, felt like this is a critique of something that's happening today, and oh, we shouldn't do that. Essentially, and a lot of it, basically, we did do that. And so going back into that mindset, I'm saying this because I rewatched some of the episodes recently. it really feels that, okay, well, this maybe was a response to a moment. It was a response to something that was happening. Let's say that. But right now, I wouldn't be as interested, let's say, if they come up with a new season, because I feel like reality is already pretty dystopic, if that makes sense. And that's why when I put that, and it sort of leads me to the next question I wanted to ask about, well, I already started asking before, like the teens, why it was the 2010s. You wrote this essay in 2015, as I mentioned before, and one of the things that you wrote in it is that, where is it? I suspect that at some point in the next decade or so, it will truly dawn on us that the increasingly inhospitable climate is of our own making, the result of policy decisions and political failures. As it happens, we're recording this while COP26 is still happening. It will be done by the time this is out. It's been both very underwhelming and overwhelming at the same time for me. But it is true at the same. So that being said, it is also true that the momentum has very clearly shifted in the past few years. I think very few people would deny that, especially when it comes to climate activism. I'm old enough. I'm 30, and I'm old enough to remember that there was a time when it really felt that there was a very small number of people actively talking about the climate, other than climate scientists, many indigenous activists, and so on. Most people, from what I can remember, were simply it wasn't part of a daily concern. Let's put it that way. I don't know if we're a majority, but it doesn't. It definitely seems that this is shifting. Let's put it that way. I think that's a reasonable assessment. But given that you wrote this 6 years ago and all of these have happened since, how would you sort of see those 6 years in relation to how Solarpunk has been developing? Has it been focusing on different things? It's definitely bigger than it used to be. Climate fiction as a broader umbrella maybe than Solarpunk. And I'm very bad at categorizing things, so feel free to kind of correct me. How have you seen this change?
Oh yeah, I mean, um, I went to COP24 a few years
Mhm.
ago, and that was really enlightening. And then I wrote my book that I've got coming out in April. Um, is set at the COP. It's set at five different versions
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
of the COP, and it was very much about that culture, that particular sort of political project. And on the one hand, it's like, gosh, it is such an uphill climb, right? Because the institute, like the framework and the institutions, are just like very flawed and don't really have the leverage um, that we need them to have, and the the um, we're sort of muddling along with, like, had we known the way things would go, right? Like, I think maybe we wouldn't be for instance, working with a consensus based UN model, right? The honor system um, that we have, right?
Yeah.
Like, it worked for the Montreal Protocol uh, to fix the hole in the ozone layer, but
Yeah.
turns out that um, climate change is just a very different problem than the problem of hydrofluorocarbons eating into the ozone layer, right? Like, it's a different class of pollutants that are like entangled into our economy in a very different way. And when the moment at which we were trying to deal with the hole in the ozone layer was also the moment that, like, DuPont Chemicals patent on Freon was coming up for expiration. So they were like, capital was all for it. It's like, yeah, like, let's go and change out all of our refrigerants and sell a bunch of new refrigerators and
Mhm.
make a lot of money on that, right? Um, and increasingly, that's how it looks now, right? That most of capital is starting to be like, it seems like we could make a lot of money if we put up a lot of new solar panels and wind farms, and, like, gosh, it, like, they kind of just run for free, and, like, they're so cheap, and, like, we can sell the energy, and, like, blah, blah, like, like, companies want to want to buy offsets. They want to do this and that. Like, so, yeah, like capital is coming around in a way that it wasn't in 2015. That's certainly good for our like chances. I don't know if it's necessarily gonna get us to any kind of utopian or truly sustainable scenario.
Sure. Yeah.
Fossil fuel is still digging in pretty hard. This is the hardest thing human beings have ever tried to do, right? It's just the most wicked of wicked problems, and we only get one shot at it. And we the best we can do in terms of like running experiments to find the best to find the best strategy is to tell little science fiction stories and try to learn from those, because we only have like one Earth to enact our strategy on. So I'm yeah I there's a section in my book in which all the like a bunch of characters are sort of holed up in the bar in the most dystopian of the scenarios, and are talking about like what went wrong, like where what did we as the UNFCCC like and our predecessors in this institution like do what could we have done better. And I think there's there's tons of things that we could have done better, but we are you never step in the same river twice. You never like work on the same wicked problem twice, right? Like the fact that we are working with this set of institutions, with this set of diplomatic procedures is that is the problem, right? That's what we have to solve for, not sort of this other hypothetical in which the Kyoto Protocol was formulated differently. Al Gore won the 2000 American election, like blah blah blah. So, like all that said, watching this COP, feeling like it's okay, there was all this buildup for it, and Biden's going there empty-handed, right? Because our sort of like the coal baron, like we have a coal baron in the Senate who's just going to say no. Or like, one semi-likely situation is we pass $500 billion worth of clean energy subsidies, like, Manchin's willing to accept that. Whenever this podcast comes out, that'll probably have already happened or not. We're all here in, November 2021 on pins and needles in America to see if that happens. But it's very possible that we will not have any like regulations that shut down existing fossil fuel infrastructure, but we do have a bunch of subsidies to kind of like build out clean energy. And in that situation, like, man, do we need some solar punks, right? We need some solar punks to push the boundaries of the renewable energy, the clean energy technologies, and so that we can outcompete the fossil infrastructure even faster, right? Because we're not going to be able to the powers that be just aren't going to let us sort of regulate those out of existence. We're just going to have to prove that they are worse than the alternative. And we might need some punks to go out and do some direct action, make it harder to run this particular stack of infrastructure, make it a lot less profitable to extract and burn fossil fuels in with a variety of tactics. It's not a great situation, but it'd be a better situation for all of us if we could just kind of smoothly pass the correct policies. But in the absence of that, like, yeah, we need a countercultural force to help get us on a better track. So, it's not the best COP so far, but there's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of energy in climate now, and I think that basic prediction that I wrote in 2015, like, oh yeah, that's right. We had blood skies over California. We had huge storms like flooding major American cities. I mean, in 2015 we'd already had some of that, right? Like we had Hurricane Sandy, which was like sort of a classic, like, oh my God, and like the superstorm that flooded New York situation that really felt like it was ripped from the climate fiction headlines. Um, but you know, now we've really had them, right, and in the context of the pandemic year, in which everyone was very finely tuned to disaster unfolding, and for a lot of people, all we could do is kind of sit in our homes and watch. So I think we've we checked that box, right, of for the most part. Obviously not everyone. Obviously there's like increasingly, particularly here in America, an increasingly irrational, uh, uh, reactionary segment of the population that is like living deeply out of touch with reality. But
Mm-hmm.
lots of people are like, oh, like, yikes, this is not going to be good. Lots of people have experienced climate disasters. So obviously it'll keep getting worse, right? I mean, one of the things I think we found since 2015, honestly, since we found since I started writing my, my scenarios book, is like, whoa, the climate's a lot more sensitive than we thought, right? Like we, like it turns out that like 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming is like a lot nastier than we thought it was going to be, right? That's what we're at now, more or less. And like, I don't think we want to stay here, right? For me, that like ramps up the eventual necessity of climate repair, of getting all that carbon out of the atmosphere, so that we can stabilize at a lower average temperature that is in a less chaotic system. On the other hand, it seems like coal, we've still got our coal barons kind of in charge of American policy, but and we're still got plenty of coal to shut down that's continuing to be built and extracted in China and elsewhere. But it does seem like the appetite for coal is a lot less than a lot of early modelers predicted, right?
Yeah.
So, it's going to be real hard to hit 1.5 C as our sort of the top of our warming. It might turn out to be a lot harder than we thought to hit 2. Or I guess it'll probably be easier than we thought to hit 2, but 2 is going to be a lot nastier to live through, right? Is kind of what we're finding. So we're making all these adjustments. We're finding out that reality does not match the is not sort of conveniently match up what the sort of these very carefully negotiated over UN targets are. The whole, and yeah, we need to be engaging in that process, and the fact that solarpunk has like become a thing now. I mean, when I wrote this, it was really like, here's an interesting idea, let's make this a thing, and it's definitely a thing now, right? I mean, there's multiple anthologies. There's like, seems like everyone, almost all the big sort of names in science fiction are writing kind of near future climate fiction novels, right? And some of them are more utopian than others. And the name solarpunk is now no longer like a joke. I mean, it's so, and it's a big town. I'm constantly finding out like, people doing solarpunk projects that I've never heard of, which is great, right? I mean, this wasn't the case in 2015. So, like you said, it's all becoming a little more. It's all, there's a lot more energy, and it's a lot more exciting, and the stakes are a lot higher. So, the onus is doubly on us to do right.
Yeah, for sure. And at least on my part, I'm trying to do more episodes on this podcast when it comes to solarpunk, as well as like writing stuff from time to time. And the reason for that is that a lot of the topics that I usually go through on this podcast tend to be pretty heavy, and arguably nothing is heavier than climate change at the moment, and probably for the foreseeable future, at least in our lifetimes and others. And I was looking for something that was that could have allowed me, not necessarily to as a form like escapism for its own sake, although I don't necessarily think that's bad either, but that it could offer me kind of energy for the present is how I would describe it. I would read these stories that are set in the future, and obviously know that they're fiction, but they would sort of hit me in a different way, or at least affect me in a different way than if I was reading. We mentioned The Shire before, so like if I was reading The Lord of the Rings, I'm reading that book. I know it's a fantasy. I know it there, but I'm not reading it and kind of with the hope that it has something to offer me in the present, if that makes sense. And that's fine. Not all books have to, but I definitely needed something that could do that, and solarpunk as the genre really ended up becoming that for me. And part of the my goal on this podcast, essentially, among other things, is to introduce this speculative movement. I really like how that definition to a wider audience, and this conversation is part of that. That being said, I would really like to at least mention two. Well, please feel free to mention more than that. But I know of two of your recent works. One is a short story that you wrote as part of a multi species cities, solarpunk urban futures, and all. I mean, listeners know this by now, but everything that we've mentioned, I will write them down in the description and on the website. But can you talk to us a bit about what is multi-species kinships, how you would imagine it, and yeah, just talk to us a bit about that, if that's okay.
Yeah, that story, The Mammoth Steps, was originally printed in Terraform, which was the science fiction vertical on Vice Motherboard, and was very kindly reprinted in the multi-species book, which I'm very glad at, because multi-species thinking is very close, near and dear to my heart. I back in 2016, I stopped eating meat, and for mostly for climate reasons. But when I did, it really felt like a whole new vista of moral thinking opened up to me. And I was suddenly, because I wasn't trying to justify my choices, my lifestyle anymore. I could see more clearly the horrible things that we do to non-humans, that we eat, that we enslave, whose homes we destroy, that we hunt for sport, um, and I was able to sort of see non-humans as subjects more readily, with their own opinions and memories and sort of inner life experience, that are trying to live a life, not a human life, but a different kind of life. And so that was a revelation that sort of crept into my thinking. And this story was kind of an early sort of attempt at sort of manifesting some of those ideas, right? Some of which were also from taking classes and talking to people in sort of the conservation world, and feeling like the most radical position about animal conservation is on the table right now is you draw a line on a map and you say humans don't go in there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You say that we're just going to patrol against poachers with guns and just let the wild animals live their wild lives. And if we do that to human beings, that's called a reservation, right? That's like a ghetto. And I think that is to me, shows a lack of imagination about how we might not just treat and have a not just have a more just relationship, but how we might have real partnerships with non-human beings. And particularly the ones that seem they're smart, they have language, they have culture, they have relationships and social structures, like elephants and dolphins and chimpanzees and so forth, right? Octopi. And so, some of those, it seems to me, were they on offer, might want to not live in, in a wilderness preserve, might want to live in a city and have an apartment and, have a job and, be able to like earn money to like spend how they wish on like doing things that they like. I mean, like what would our cities look like if they were built to have that, to have multiple different species kind of engage in them as a project? And so, and I also think that, there's sort of a what if there in terms of, we have all this computational power. We're spending a lot of it making like really like dumb looking NFTs. I don't know. I mean, I think there's sort of a cultural debate and like a technological debate that kind of push in two different directions for me there. But, we spend a lot of it like analyzing data to serve people ads, right? What if instead we put all that computational power, or a lot of that computational power, toward, figuring out how to communicate with other species, right? To analyzing their language and making sense of it. That's like sort of, kind of your classic sci-fi what if. What if we invented elephant language translation?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what's in this story, which is about like a guy, a boy and his friend who's a de-extincted mammoth in Siberia, and they go on a little sort of road trip together. They walk their way all the way down to Thailand to meet elephants, and find that the elephants there have kind of rebelled a little bit and are trying to now build a more integrated human elephant society, where elephants are not sort of a slave class, right? So yeah, and I've got another like book in the works that has it's been on my mind for a long time, and I keep trying to, probably next year will be the year I really try to write it, but it's kind of an alternate history, in which we have had a whole bunch of revolutions that have got us to a different political place where we are sharing our world with other species, and it's like a detective novel. So it's sort of a socialist detective novel, and in a world of talking elephants. But but it's a great book, and then I was really glad that this story was included and seems to have caught some fresh caught a fresh audience. So
yeah, I actually you mentioned maybe next year working on another book, but you have one that is upcoming as well. Can you talk a bit about that?
So in April 2022, my first kind of English language book. I have a collection of short fiction published in Italian. So if you have listeners who speak and read Italian,
I
I
actually have the book. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful! I
Yeah.
don't have a physical copy yet. But that's great. I think my contributor copies are in our in our fraught supply chain at the moment. Lo Stato Solare. So, if you read Italian, that's got most of my short fiction in it. But this is my first book in English. And I wrote it mostly as my master's thesis. I took like an extra year to write a book-length master's thesis for sustainability. And so it's inspired by a set of scenarios used by the IPCC, used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that sort of informs the COP and all the UN negotiations. So they have a set of scenarios called the shared socioeconomic pathways that were used, some of them in the AR6 report, in different ways. And these are kind of replacements for the previous sort of sets of scenarios, called the RCPs, that are kind of just about how much how much carbon we dump, right? And the SSPs are kind of like, okay, these things are super socially entangled. Like let's lay bare what our assumptions are going to be about um, how the sort of future of the economy and society is going to look, right? That informs our questions of like does what does like 5% GDP growth equal like more emissions, or does it equal less emissions, right? Um, so there's 5 SSPs. Um, SSP1 is like the sort of utopian uh, uh, ideal, right? That, or not necessarily utopian, but it's a sustainability scenario. It's where we manage to very pretty much like smoothly get to a sustainable world, right? Like things go well for us. We don't meet a lot of challenges to either mitigation or adaptation. SSP2 is kind of middle of the road. It's like present trends continue. SSP3, that's like way out in the chart space, and that's like a nasty one. There's sort of global breakdown of institutions. There's a lot of regional conflict. And then you have these two to the sides. You have SSP4, which is like the high inequality scenario, where we manage to like cut our emissions, but the economies become really unequal, and we do a bad job of adapting to climate change. So the impacts of climate change are felt really disproportionately by poor nations and poor people. And then you have SSP5, which is kind of a scenario in which we say like, okay, let's not even bother trying to shift off fossil fuels. Let's use all that cheap energy, even though it's not that cheap anymore, to hyper develop the developing world, and like ask like, is this in fact sort of better to create all this sort of economic growth and just sort of adapt our way through the consequences. And so, I when I first encountered these, I was like, oh, these are science fiction stories. These are climate fiction stories. So I talked with scholars who sort of worked on them, and decided to try to write a set of stories that like illustrated these 5 scenarios. And I decided I kind of want them to be sort of like a comparative experiment where I'm sort of eliminating as many variables as I can. So in a way, it's like one story told 5 different ways, right?
Mhm.
It is the story of COP60, and there's a sort of an overlapping cast of characters that are you see in pretty much all the stories, and but because they're in different scenarios, we've made different choices between now and like 2035, 2040. By the time they're at it in like 2054, they're all living very different lives. They've grown up differently. Uh, they're like, and the COP is a different kind of institution in each of these scenarios, and so the it I tried to kind of create this sort of experiment and see what it was like to kind of take the one kind of core situation and sort of splay it out onto this SSP chart space. So it's really fun and very proud of the book. It also, if some of your readers are like academics who want to teach about climate change or climate fiction or environmental humanities, it's got sort of like a section for that talks, pretty extensively about the SSPs as like a thinking tool, about climate change as a seeing instrument, or climate fiction as a seeing instrument for talking about the future. So yeah, I think I'm hoping people will find it useful for classes and stuff. And I think the book is also pretty entertaining. Like definitely some of like the funniest jokes I've ever written have been in there, and I got to sort of do the full gamut between of kind of or of like dystopian futures and of different flavors, and also a utopian one to cap it off. So yeah, the book is called Our Shared Storm, a novel of 5 climate futures. Comes out in early April from Fordham University Press. I've bought a domain name that I will hopefully make it easy for people to find it, called at sharedstorm.com, www.sharedstorm.com. there's nothing there when we record, but by the time this comes out, I will hopefully have put something up to make it easy. So yeah, I'm really excited for this book to come out. Like to some extent, I'm like, gosh, I wish it was out right now because like the COP is going on, and
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that
yeah.
would be perfect. But it for I think for a lot of us who are now starting to pay attention to things like the COP, to pay attention to the UN process that sort of has holds all of our future in its hands to some degree. I think the book is probably pretty useful in understanding that. And yeah, so hopefully when this comes out, your readers will be inspired and can go pre-order it.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely encourage them to do so, and I will include that in the description as well. But sort of like as I always do with all guests, I ask them to recommend 3 books to our listeners to sort of wrap the conversation up. And so, what are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners? And if you can briefly say why.
I think I honestly think like it might be like most useful for people who are interested in solarpunk and have like sort of dived in to the extent as you do, to like go like read some good contemporary cyberpunk too,
Hmm.
and sort of see the points of contrast. So like um, a few of those that uh, readers might want to check out are like Infomocracy by Malka Older,
Hmm.
which is just like the best book about globalization. Uh, uh, and like it really gets at like what it feels like to what it will feel like to live in like a truly globalized society, um, and is like just so bristling with imagination, um, and tons and tons of political ideas that I think as somebody who wrote about how like solar punk should really think a lot about politics, I think we should consider. Um, you know, Nomon is a great modern cyberpunk uh, book that is by Nick Harkaway that I really like. Um, that just has such a and you know it is so literarily ambitious, and I think should kind of be on everyone's radar. Um, Infinite Detail by Tim Mon, right? That's like another sort of um, like super contemporary uh, story that you kind of like in some senses you could imagine telling like the solar punk version of Infinite Detail, which is a story about like what happens if the internet were to like boom go away, and the kinds of collapse that come with that. And so those are all like really educational books to dive into that I think offer good points of contrast. Um, I mentioned as like for solar punk stuff, I mentioned Becky Chambers, A Psalm of the Wild Built. Um, I think that's a very beautiful little text. Stan Robinson, he's got his sort of UN FCCC book, A Ministry for the Future. That's got a lot of really good stuff. Probably the most the most harrowing piece of climate fiction ever is like the first chapter of that book about a deadly heat wave in India, and like that really does what I think no sort of apocalyptic far future waste. We live in the post climate change wasteland book has ever done, as like really bring home just like how scary it is when the weather just turns against your body. Um, and the book is full of really cool ideas. Um, and Walk Away by Cory Doctorow, that's like another one that is kind of like solar punk minus the solar, but in terms of uh, it just doesn't have a lot to say about the energy questions that I think are really central to solar punk. But in terms of like social organization and imagining sort of radical ways of connecting with each other and living and opting out of the sort of hegemonic system, which we may or may not be able to do, right? I think that's up in the air whether or not I think we're all making a kind of calculus about do we think there is one single hegemonic system that like overpowers everything else? Like, can we change that system, right?
Yeah.
And it's different in each of the sort of quadrants that creates, right? Because if you think, and I think Solarpunk is kind of the opinion that we maybe can't change the hegemonic system, but it is not totalizing, right? That there is in fact a competitive, like a space where you can build an alternative, right? And I think that there's good arguments to be made for each of these quadrants, right? To be made that in fact it is a totalizing system, capitalism, and but we do have an opportunity to change it, right? Like we can build a mass movement and do mass politics that I think is not countercultural, that like stems from the needs of the majoritarian culture and stems from the organizing and the power and the sort of position in the economy of the working class, right? A much more traditionally Marxist approach. And so I think I hope that, like, I guess since we're on sort of the final word, I hope that people are like inspired by Solarpunk, but not necessarily. They should think carefully about that calculation, right? And not necessarily assume that the best strategy is to go and build a little commune and try to, have a garden and do permaculture and have rooftop solar and stuff. I mean, that's like a fine thing to do, but it could be that like the best strategy is striking and organizing our workplaces and taking to the streets and shutting down the economy until the powers that be do what we want, or seizing the means of production, right? I mean, these are all things I think we should consider on the table and try to make the best choices that we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Andrew, thanks a lot we've spoken for quite a bit. I appreciate the time you've taken out of your day to speak to me, and this will be the first episode of 2022, and I think it's a nice way to start the year. But yeah, thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks for having me. I know we went over a bit, but really appreciate it.
No, we didn't. It's fine. All
appreciate
good.
the opportunity.
Thanks.
Cool.